My name is Walter Hensley, and I turned 79 last winter, though I often feel as if the years have pressed down twice as hard upon me, each one adding not just weight to my shoulders, but also a heaviness to the heart that no doctor can measure. I live alone in a modest single-story house on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town, the kind of place where people know one another by name but keep their distance out of habit and politeness, waving from across lawns without ever really crossing them. My wife, Mary Ann, passed away almost a decade ago, leaving me with an empty bed and a silence that even the old wall clock in the hallway cannot fill, its steady ticking only emphasizing how vast the quiet has become. We were married for 53 years, and in that time I learned how to brew coffee just the way she liked it, how to listen when her day had been difficult, how to keep the house warm in winter and cool in summer, how to share space without ever feeling crowded. Now I do all those things by myself, and sometimes I catch myself speaking aloud in the kitchen as if she might still be around the corner, only to stop mid-sentence when I realize I am rehearsing conversations that will never happen again. I begin each morning deliberately slowly, stretching out small rituals because they give me the illusion of company. I grind the beans and place 3 careful spoonfuls into the filter, pour the water, add the pinch of salt that Marianne swore by, and then wait for the scent to rise. It is not her coffee, never will be, but I still breathe it in as if it could summon her. Breakfast is usually a piece of toast with peanut butter, though more often than not I just nibble at it while reading the newspaper, the print blurring sometimes because my eyes tire quickly, sometimes because tears threaten when I stumble upon articles that remind me of the past, like community announcements mentioning people I once knew, most of them now gone. My daughter Clara used to call once every couple of weeks after her mother died, her voice brisk, professional, always hurrying to end the conversation with phrases like, "I'll check in again soon," or "Let's talk when things calm down." Those calls have dwindled over the years until they became rare, almost accidental, as if she dialed my number by mistake and decided to make the best of it. Clara has a good job in insurance, lives not far from me, and presents herself as a responsible woman, admired by neighbors and co-workers. Yet for me, she has grown distant, cold, impatient with the fact that I still exist and require acknowledgement. She was my only child, the one Mary Ann and I spoiled with the best we could afford, the one we cheered for at every school play and drove to piano lessons, the one who went off to college on the East Coast with our savings and our blessings. We thought she would visit home often, but she built her own life so thoroughly that we became footnotes in it, tolerated at holidays, displayed when convenient, tucked away when not. I do not blame her for growing up, for moving on, for becoming her own person. What pains me is how quickly she has rewritten the story of her childhood, how she speaks of sacrifices we never resented, as if they were debts still unpaid, how she looks at me not with affection, but with a clinical gaze, assessing how much longer I will be around and what loose ends she will have to tie when I am gone. It is not unusual, I am told, for children to drift apart from their parents, yet in my case the drift feels less like a gentle tide and more like a deliberate pushing away, a rejection that stings every time I attempt to bridge the distance. My health, though fragile in ways, has not abandoned me entirely. My knees complain when the weather changes, my hands sometimes tremble when holding a cup, and stares have become my sworn enemy. But my mind remains intact, sharp enough to read long novels, solve crosswords, and remember details from decades past. I cling to this fact because too often Clara treats me as if senility has already claimed me, correcting me when I recall a story differently, interrupting me as though I were incapable of finishing a thought, sighing whenever I ask her to repeat, something because her words have been swallowed by the static on the phone line. I rarely leave the house now except for groceries or short walks to the park where ducks gather around the pond. Once, not long after Marianne's passing, I tried to join a senior group at the community center, but I felt like an intruder among people who already knew each other. And besides, Clara had dismissed the idea as a waste of time, suggesting instead that I consider a retirement home where everything would be taken care of. I know what she meant. Easier for her, less responsibility, no guilt when she forgets to call. But I have resisted. This little house holds my history. The photographs of our wedding day, the old armchair where I used to rock Clara when she was an infant, the small garden Mary Ann tended with such devotion. To leave it would be to abandon the only proof that my life mattered. So my days follow a steady rhythm. Coffee, newspaper, a bit of cleaning, perhaps a puzzle, maybe a walk if the weather is merciful. The afternoons stretch into long corridors of silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the distant bark of a dog. Evenings are worse. Shadows creep in through the windows, and I feel the walls drawing closer, pressing me with memories I cannot escape. I sometimes turn on the television for company, but the programs are meaningless chatter, advertisements for things I neither need nor want. When I lie down at night, the bed feels impossibly large, the blankets too heavy, the air too still. I whisper good night to Mary Ann, though I do not know if she can hear me, and close my eyes hoping for a dream in which she appears. I am not a man given to drama or complaint, but I will confess that loneliness corrodes the soul more steadily than any disease. It makes you doubt your worth, makes you question whether the people you loved ever truly loved you back, makes you wonder if all the sacrifices you made were invisible after all. I sometimes catch myself rehearsing apologies I do not owe, as if, by admitting to mistakes that never happened, I could coax affection back into Clara's voice. Yet even then, when I imagine her listening, I hear impatience in her tone, the clatter of her fingers on a keyboard as she multitasks, the sigh of a daughter too busy for her father. Neighbors pass by and greet me politely, but no one lingers. A couple across the street sometimes brings cookies at Christmas, and the boy next door occasionally helps shovel snow, but these are gestures, not bonds. The truth is that the people who should be closest, my own blood, have become strangers. I cling to the belief that perhaps one day Clara will remember that she still has a father, that she might knock on my door not out of duty or necessity, but out of genuine desire to spend time together. It is a fragile hope, one I cradle carefully because if it breaks there will be nothing left. As I sit at my kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the clock measure out the hours, I often ask myself how it came to this. How did a family built on decades of love and shared struggle dissolve into cold formality and distance? Did I demand too much? Did I fail to express affection in the right ways? Or is it simply the way of the world now, where old men become burdens, where age itself is considered a fault, where children raised with devotion see their parents not as human beings, but as obstacles to convenience? I have no answer, only the gnawing awareness that I stand on the threshold of my final years, and that threshold is a lonely one. It is in this state of mind, half resigned, half yearning, that the story truly begins, though I did not know then what humiliation and betrayal still awaited me, nor how deeply my own daughter's voice, sharp and cutting, would echo in my ears long after the moment had passed. For now, in this introduction to my days, I am simply a man keeping routine, clinging to memories, and carrying a hope so faint it barely flickers, unaware that soon it would be extinguished by the very person I trusted most. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, a day that had started like countless others with coffee, toast, and the newspaper, when the phone rang and Clara's name appeared on the caller ID, the thin digital letters glowing with a significance far greater than they deserved, because she seldom called without a purpose, and every time she did, I felt a complicated mixture of dread and fragile hope. Her voice, when I answered, was clipped and rushed, but beneath the impatience there was an urgency that caught my attention. She said she needed me to come by the house, that it was important, and when I asked if something was wrong, if the grandchildren were all right, she brushed aside my questions with a vague assurance that everything was fine, only that she and her husband Mark wanted to talk about the future. That phrase unsettled me immediately, for it was the same kind of language Mary Ann used to employ when we discussed financial planning or retirement, words that usually masked difficult conversations, behind a polite facade, and I felt a prickle of unease even as I agreed to come. I still drove, though less often, and so I put on my better jacket, the brown one Clara had once said made me look dignified, and I polished my shoes as best I could before heading out, because no matter how strained our relationship had become, some part of me clung to the notion that appearances mattered, that if I showed up looking respectable, she might, even for a moment, see the father who once carried her on his shoulders and paid for her piano recitals, rather than just the old man. She had grown accustomed to dismissing. The drive across town was uneventful, though I noticed that my hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from age alone, but from the anticipation of whatever awaited me. And when I pulled into her neatly trimmed driveway, I sat in the car for a few moments watching the curtains in the front window stir, certain that she or Mark was already peeking to see how long it would take me to get out. Clara opened the door before I reached the porch, her expression fixed in that professional half-smile she used at work, the one that conveyed neither warmth nor hostility, but rather efficiency, as though even in greeting her own father she was managing a transaction. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and some expensive candle, clean to the point of sterility, and I felt out of place immediately, as though I were entering a hotel lobby rather than the home of my daughter. She did not offer a hug, merely gestured for me to step inside and led me toward the living room where Mark was already seated, his laptop open on the coffee table, though he closed it with an exaggerated deliberateness when I entered, as if to underline that my presence had disrupted his important business. He stood only halfway, extended a limp handshake, and resumed his seat with the air of a man tolerating an intrusion rather than welcoming a guest. I sat gingerly on the edge of the sofa, waiting for Clara to explain the urgency, but she busied herself with arranging coasters, adjusting the throw pillows, and finally perching on the arm of a chair as though she could not bear to sit too close. At last she began to speak, and her words came in the rehearsed cadence of someone who had practiced them in front of a mirror. She said she and Mark were concerned about me living alone, that it was not safe, that neighbors had mentioned seeing me struggle with groceries or walk too slowly to the mailbox. I knew immediately that this was not about concern, for if they were genuinely worried, they would have asked how I was feeling or offered to help. But instead they spoke as though presenting evidence in a case against me, listing supposed frailties with the precision of a prosecutor. Mark added that at my age, things can go downhill quickly, and that it was better to make arrangements now than wait for a crisis. I listened, nodding slowly, though inside I felt my chest tighten with resentment, because I knew where this was leading, and I was right. Clara leaned forward and said they had been looking into assisted living facilities, that one in particular was highly recommended, clean, with a good reputation, and that perhaps I should consider selling my house to make the transition easier. The way she said my house carried no acknowledgement that it was the place Marianne and I had built our lives, the garden she had planted, the rooms filled with our laughter, the nights when Clara herself had been tucked into bed under that roof. To her it was simply real estate, a burden waiting to be converted into cash. I tried to protest gently, reminding her that I managed well enough, that I cooked my meals, paid my bills, even kept the yard tidy. But she shook her head with the patient condescension of a doctor explaining to a stubborn patient that denial would not change the diagnosis. The grandchildren did not appear, though I heard footsteps upstairs and the muffled sound of music leaking from headphones. Once they would have rushed down to greet me, to ask for stories or treats, but now they remained invisible, like actors written out of the script of my life. I asked after them anyway, and Clara responded in the briefest possible terms, saying they were busy with studies, uninterested in conversation, and I felt the sting of being dismissed not only by my daughter, but by the very children I had once held. On my lap, the conversation turned colder still when Mark produced a folder from the side table, documents neatly clipped, brochures for facilities, financial breakdowns, even a draft of what selling my house might yield. The efficiency of it all made clear that this was not a spontaneous concern, but a plan long in the making, presented to me only when they believed resistance would be futile. I glanced at the glossy pages showing smiling elderly people playing cards, attending craft classes, and I felt not reassurance but humiliation, as though my life had already been signed away and my only role was to consent to the execution of their decision. I told them I was not ready for such a step, that I valued my independence, but my words seemed to bounce off the polished surfaces of their living room like raindrops on glass, heard but not absorbed. Clara sighed, and in that sigh was every ounce of frustration she had accumulated over the years, frustration at a father who did not vanish conveniently, who insisted on remaining visible, who carried with him the weight of memories she preferred to discard. She rose abruptly and said we would revisit the subject soon, her tone final, brooking no further argument, and Mark opened his laptop again as though I had already ceased to exist. When I left their house, the air outside felt sharper, and I realized I was trembling, not from the cool breeze, but from the indignity of the encounter. They had not asked me about my days, my feelings, my health. They had only presented their agenda, cloaked in the language of concern, but fueled by impatience and calculation. As I walked to my car, I saw the curtains stir again, and for a fleeting moment I thought, perhaps Clara might come after me, call me back, soften her words, but the door remained closed. I drove home slowly, the streets blurred by a haze of anger and sorrow, knowing that something fundamental had shifted, that my daughter no longer saw me as her father, but as a problem to be managed. I did not yet know how cruelly that view would manifest, but the seed had been planted in that conversation, and it would grow into something that would shake the last fragile threads of trust between us. The following weeks after that uneasy meeting were filled with a kind of silence that was heavier than usual, because now every day in my house felt shadowed by the knowledge that Clara and Mark were not simply distant, but actively preparing to cut me off from the life I had built, and though she did not call often, the rare occasions when she did were marked by a tone that suggested her patience was wearing thin, as if she were waiting for me to surrender. I tried to maintain my routines. I told myself that nothing had changed, yet I could not escape the feeling that I was being watched from afar, judged for how many grocery bags I could carry or how long it took me to mow the lawn. Neighbors sometimes asked casual questions that seemed oddly specific, as though someone had already inquired about me, and I began to suspect that Clara was gathering testimony of my supposed decline. Each time I caught myself thinking such things, I felt ashamed, because no father wishes to imagine his daughter plotting against him. But the unease grew stronger until it became impossible to dismiss. The first clear sign came when she visited unannounced one Saturday morning, stepping into my kitchen with the air of a health inspector rather than a daughter, her eyes sweeping across the counter, the sink, the pile of mail, and finally landing on the old armchair where I often sat with the crossword. She made a small noise in her throat, half sigh, half laugh, and said that the place looked a little cluttered, though I had cleaned only the day before. I offered her coffee, but she declined, saying she had already had some, and then, without asking, she opened my refrigerator and began moving items around, pulling out a container of leftovers and holding it up as though it were evidence. She asked how long it had been there, and when I answered honestly that I had cooked it 3 days ago, she shook her head, muttering about spoiled food and health risks. I stood there watching her rummage through my belongings, feeling smaller with every comment, as though my home had ceased to be mine. The humiliation deepened when she began questioning me about my medications. She asked whether I was taking them regularly, whether I remembered the dosages, whether I had seen a doctor recently. I tried to assure her that I was meticulous, that I kept everything in a labeled pill box, but she seemed unconvinced, opening drawers until she found the box herself, inspecting it as though searching for mistakes. When she found that one slot was empty earlier than the others, she frowned and asked if I had doubled a dose. I explained that I had simply refilled the container too soon, yet she looked at me with the expression of someone who believes she has caught a liar. For a moment I felt like a child being scolded, and in that moment the gulf between us widened beyond repair. Mark arrived soon after, carrying with him an air of authority that clashed with the intimacy of my living room. He spoke as though delivering a lecture, telling me that aging was inevitable, that denial helped no one, that families had to make hard choices. His words were polished, perhaps rehearsed with Clara, and each sentence landed like a hammer, reducing me further. I tried to explain that I valued my independence, that I was still capable, but he interrupted, saying capability was a matter of perception and that, from the outside, I already looked frail. That phrase, from the outside, echoed in my mind because it confirmed what I had suspected. They were less concerned with my well-being than with appearances, with how neighbors, colleagues, and friends might judge them if their father lived alone, vulnerable, potentially embarrassing them. The conversation ended with Clara announcing that they would begin checking in more often, a phrase that filled me with dread rather than comfort, for it meant that my life was no longer my own, that every action would be scrutinized, every stumble exaggerated into evidence of incapacity. They left soon after, but not before Clara insisted on taking a set of my house keys, just in case. And though I wanted to refuse, I found myself unable to say no, the weight of her disapproval pressing down on me until I surrendered. When the door closed behind them, I sank into the armchair, staring at the indentations they had left on the carpet, feeling as though invaders had passed through and stripped the place of its warmth. Days later, the invasion became literal when I returned from a short walk to find Clara inside, having let herself in with the spare keys. She was moving through the rooms with her phone out, snapping photographs of the kitchen, the bathroom, the pile of magazines on the coffee table. When I asked what she was doing, she replied that she needed to document the conditions so she could show me how unsafe the environment was. I felt the blood rush to my face, humiliation mixing with fury. But before I could speak, she told me not to be defensive, that this was for my own good. I realized then that she no longer saw me as a person with agency, but as a case study, a project to be managed, an old man whose consent was unnecessary. The first real public humiliation occurred soon afterward when she insisted that I join her and Mark for dinner at their house. I had hoped that perhaps the invitation was an olive branch, but it turned out to be another stage in their campaign. At the table, with the grandchildren present but disinterested, Clara corrected nearly everything I said. When I recounted a memory from her childhood, she interrupted to say that I had misremembered, that it had happened differently, casting a quick glance at the children as though to warn them not to believe my version. When I mentioned that I had taken a walk to the park, she sighed and said I should not be walking alone, that it was dangerous. Mark chuckled at this, adding that perhaps I should start carrying identification at all times, in case I get confused and lost. The grandchildren laughed softly, embarrassed perhaps, but not defending me, and I felt the sting of being reduced to a joke at my own family's table. The climax of that evening came when Clara served dessert and placed in front of me a small bowl of pudding, explaining to the others that she thought it would be easier for me to chew than the apple pie they were having. I had never had trouble with pie in my life, my teeth still strong enough, but the implication was unmistakable. I was no longer fit to share in the same meal. I pushed the bowl away and said I wanted the pie, but she insisted, her voice firm, and for a moment we stared at each other across the table, her authority clashing with my dignity. I finally relented, taking a spoonful of the tasteless pudding, but inside I felt something shatter, a realization that I had been stripped of equality, that I had been demoted from father to dependent, from man to burden. When I left that evening, Mark walked me to the door and said quietly, almost kindly, that I should not take things personally, that Clara only wanted what was best. Yet the condescension in his tone cut deeper than outright hostility, for it confirmed that they believed I no longer possessed the right to define what was best for myself. As I stepped into the night air, the cool breeze could not wash away the heat of shame burning in my face. I drove home with trembling hands, every mile heavy with the knowledge that the battle had begun, that my daughter had crossed a line from which she would not retreat. The turning point arrived one evening when Clara insisted that I come over again for what she called a family discussion, a phrase that sounded innocent on the surface but carried with it the weight of a tribunal. I debated refusing, but a stubborn fragment of hope in me whispered that perhaps she wished to reconcile, to soften her tone, to recognize that she had been too harsh. I prepared carefully, choosing the same brown jacket, polishing my shoes, telling myself that if I appeared composed, she might see me as more than the burden she imagined. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense from the very start. The lights too bright, the table already set, the grandchildren absent again, leaving only Clara and Mark, both of them positioned as though this were not a dinner, but a negotiation. The meal began with a strained politeness, Mark asking perfunctory questions about my health, Clara smiling too tightly, but soon the conversation shifted into the territory I dreaded. Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped, and announced that she could no longer ignore what she described as my decline, that neighbors had reported me stumbling on the sidewalk, that I had supposedly forgotten to pay a utility bill, that she had found the refrigerator half empty. I tried to counter each accusation, explaining that I had tripped on uneven pavement, that the bill had been delayed by the mail, that I shopped every few days rather than once a week, but my words were brushed aside as excuses. Mark added gravely that it was irresponsible for me to continue living alone, that I risked injury, that I was placing an unfair burden on Clara should anything happen. The conversation grew heated when Clara revealed that she had already toured an assisted living facility and placed a deposit to reserve a room, claiming it was refundable, but speaking with the certainty of someone who had already made the decision. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands shaking as I asked how she could make such arrangements without even consulting me. But she raised her voice and said she was tired of my stubbornness, that I was in denial, that I had become a danger to myself. Her words were sharp, rehearsed, and delivered with a force that left no room for argument. Mark sat back with folded arms, watching the exchange as though satisfied to let her play the role of enforcer. I rose from my chair, intending to leave before the humiliation grew worse. But Clara followed me into the hallway, her voice rising, accusing me of never listening, of making everything harder, of clinging to the past. When I tried to walk toward the door, she seized me by the front of my shirt, her grip surprisingly strong, and yanked me backward, shouting, "Get out, old man. If you refuse to act like family, then you don't deserve one." The words struck harder. Then her hand, a sentence that severed what little bond remained. I stumbled, hitting my shoulder against the wall, and for a moment I felt more object than father, dragged like a sack of laundry rather than a human being. My legs buckled, and I found myself on my knees, staring up at my daughter, her face contorted with rage, unrecognizable as the little girl who once clung to my hand at the zoo. The commotion drew the attention of neighbors outside. I could hear voices, footsteps, someone gasping. Clara realized too late that the door was open, that her performance of control had spilled into the street. I heard the unmistakable click of a phone recording, someone capturing the scene, her fingers gripping my shirt, my body half sprawled, her voice still echoing with the venomous command to leave. She let go abruptly as if burned and stepped back, her breathing ragged. Mark appeared in the hallway, his expression flickering between alarm and irritation, muttering that this was not how they had planned it, that she needed to calm down. But the damage was done, the witnesses outside murmuring, the evidence now preserved not in memory alone, but in video. I gathered myself slowly, pushing against the wall for support, the humiliation heavier than the bruise blooming on my shoulder. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear, grief, and a fury I struggled to contain, not only because she had manhandled me like an intruder in her home, but because she had spoken words that could never be unsaid. When I finally managed to stand, my voice was calm, too calm perhaps, as I told her that I would indeed get out, not just from her house, but from the illusion that we still shared a bond of love or respect. She tried to backtrack, to say that she had spoken in anger, but the neighbors' voices outside reminded us both that the truth had already escaped her walls. The walk back to my car felt endless, each step accompanied by the knowledge that something irreversible had happened. I could not erase the sight of her face twisted with contempt, the feel of her grip bruising my chest, the sound of her voice branding me an unwanted old man. In that moment, the fragile hope I had carried for years, the belief that one day she might soften, finally shattered, leaving behind only a hollow ache. Yet hidden within that ache there stirred the faint beginning of something else, a resolve, not yet fully formed but undeniable, that I would not allow myself to be erased so easily, that the dignity she tried to strip from me would be reclaimed, even if I had to stand alone against her and the world. After that night when Clara dragged me by the shirt and screamed words that even now ring in my ears with the sharpness of broken glass, I thought perhaps the storm had reached its peak, that she might feel remorse after neighbors confronted her with what they had witnessed, or at least embarrassment at having lost her temper so violently in public. But I underestimated her determination, or perhaps her desperation, for rather than softening, she doubled down, and what followed in the days and weeks afterward revealed not only the depth of her contempt, but also the calculation behind her actions, a strategy that was far more dangerous than a fit of rage. The first sign came 2 mornings later when I was startled awake by a loud knock at my front door, and upon opening it I found 2 uniformed police officers standing on my porch, their expressions polite but firm. They explained that they had received a complaint of domestic disturbance from my daughter, who claimed that I had become aggressive during our last visit, that I had shoved her and shouted obscenities, and that she was concerned for both her safety and my mental state. My legs nearly gave way under me as I tried to comprehend the brazenness of such a lie, for though the neighbors had seen the truth, Clara had preemptively filed her version with the authorities, attempting to establish a narrative in which I was the unstable aggressor. I stammered a denial, my voice shaking, but the officers assured me they were not there to arrest me, only to gather information. By some miracle, or perhaps the courage of a neighbor, the video taken that night had already begun circulating quietly, and when one of the officers mentioned that they had been shown a copy, the tone shifted subtly. Instead of suspicion, there was a flicker of sympathy in their eyes, and one of them even murmured that family conflicts were often the most painful. Still, the humiliation of standing in my doorway like a criminal suspect gnawed at me, and when they finally left, I collapsed into the armchair, breathing as though I had run a marathon, the betrayal settling deeper into my bones. Clara did not relent. She called the next day, her voice icy, demanding to know why I had twisted the story with neighbors, why I had allowed gossip to circulate, and when I reminded her that she had been caught on video dragging me like a sack of trash, she fell, silent for a moment before declaring that I must have manipulated people into recording selectively, implying that I was cunning enough to orchestrate my own victimhood. It was then I realized the truth no longer mattered to her, that she was prepared to rewrite reality itself in order to justify what she had done. The campaign escalated in subtler ways. Strange letters began arriving in my mailbox, brochures for assisted living facilities, addressed in her handwriting but mailed through the post as if from a neutral source, with notes scribbled in the margins reminding me of safety risks and early memory loss. Once, while shopping at the grocery store, I ran into an acquaintance who asked gently whether I was managing all right, and if I needed help with finances, and when I pressed, she admitted that Clara had spoken to her, portraying me as a confused old man prone to forgetting things. It dawned on me that Clara was building a case not in a courtroom yet, but in the court of public opinion, spreading seeds of doubt so that when the time came, others would nod and say they had long suspected something was wrong. The grandchildren, who once would have been my allies, became distant shadows. On the rare occasion I saw them, their eyes slid away from mine, their conversations clipped, as though they had been warned not to engage too deeply. I overheard one whisper to the other that Grandpa gets confused sometimes, a phrase I knew they had not invented themselves but borrowed from their mother's narrative. To lose not only my daughter but also the children I had once carried on my shoulders felt like being erased from the family portrait while still alive. The financial angle emerged soon after. I discovered that Clara had attempted to access one of my bank accounts, claiming she was listed as an emergency contact. Though the attempt failed, the bank manager discreetly informed me, his tone one of cautious concern, and I realized that her goal was not merely to confine me to a facility, but to gain control over everything I had worked for, the savings Mary Ann. and I had guarded carefully the house we had paid off through decades of labor. Suddenly her insistence on my incapacity made perfect sense. If she could paint me as unfit, she could petition for guardianship, giving her legal control over my assets. The humiliation deepened when she confronted me directly during another visit, this time with Mark at her side, their voices rehearsed like actors in a play. They told me they had consulted a lawyer, that guardianship might be the best option for my protection. And when I laughed bitterly at the phrase, Clara snapped that I was being ungrateful, that after all she had done, I should trust her judgment. I asked what exactly she had done for me in recent years, since every memory I had was of neglect, of silence, of dismissive phone calls, and she flushed red, accusing me of rewriting history, claiming that she had sacrificed countless hours worrying about me. That word, sacrificed, hit me like a slap for a twisted concern into resentment, as though my existence itself were a burden she had nobly endured. The confrontation turned uglier when she accused me of being the reason her life had not been easier, that if I had sold the house earlier, she and Margaret could have moved into a bigger one, that if I had been less stubborn about independence, she could have advanced further in her career without the guilt of an elderly father living alone. To hear my daughter frame my survival as an obstacle to her success felt like a betrayal so profound that words deserted me. I sat in stunned silence as she continued, listing grievances, rewriting every act of love from her childhood into a debt she believed I owed her. I began to notice small intrusions into my daily life. Once I returned home to find drawers slightly ajar, papers moved as though someone had rifled through them. Another time, I discovered that my checkbook was missing, only to find it later slipped back into place with 2 pages torn out. I had no proof, but the suspicion burned inside me, and I started locking the doors more carefully, double-checking windows, keeping important documents hidden. The house that had once been my sanctuary became a fortress under siege, each creak of the floorboards at night a reminder that I was no longer safe, even in my own space. The weight of isolation pressed harder. Friends I had known distanced themselves, some too polite to say why, others clearly influenced by Clara's whispered warnings. One longtime neighbor stopped inviting me to weekly card games, muttering something about not wanting to overwhelm me, and I recognized Clara's phrasing and his tone. I realized then that she was not only dismantling my autonomy but also dismantling my reputation, ensuring that when the final move came, whether guardianship or forced relocation, I would have little support to resist. Yet even as the walls closed in, a small fire of resolve grew within me. Each humiliation, each lie, each attempt to strip me of dignity only hardened my determination not to surrender quietly. I began keeping meticulous records of conversations, dates, even the expressions on their faces, as though preparing for a trial that had not yet been scheduled. I told myself that if Clara saw me as an adversary rather than a father, then I would meet her on that battlefield, armed not with anger, but with truth. Still, the nights were the hardest. Alone in my bed, I replayed her words, "Get out, old man," over and over, wondering how the child I once cradled could look at me with such contempt. I remember teaching her to ride a bicycle, her small hands gripping the handlebars, her laughter ringing through the summer air, and I asked myself what had gone wrong. What invisible line had been crossed that transformed love into calculation? There was no answer, only the ache of knowing that the bond had been severed not by distance or misunderstanding, but by choice. The escalation reached its cruelest form when Clara threatened, in a heated phone call, to have me declared incompetent formally, warning that if I resisted, she would take me to court. I listened in silence, my jaw tight, and when she finished I told her calmly that I was prepared, that I would not yield, that the truth had a way of surfacing no matter how carefully buried. She laughed bitterly, mocking the idea that anyone would take my side, but beneath her laughter I detected a flicker of unease, a crack in her confidence, perhaps because she knew that the video of her dragging me, screaming, was still out there, a piece of evidence she could not erase. In that moment I understood that the war between us had entered a new phase. No longer was it merely about pride or misunderstanding. It was about survival, about dignity, about whether I would end my days as a man with agency or as a puppet controlled by the daughter I had once loved beyond measure. And though the weight of betrayal threatened to crush me, that small flame of defiance burned brighter, illuminating a path forward. The escalation had revealed her motives, stripped away the facade of concern, and left only the raw hunger for control. Knowing that truth, painful as it was, gave me strength, and I swore silently that I would not let her win. Not with lies, not with force, not with the cold cruelty that had already stolen too much from me. The breaking point came on a damp Sunday evening when Clara, determined to tighten the noose she had been fashioning for months, arrived at my door unannounced with Mark at her side and a folded stack of legal papers clutched in her hand. Her mouth set in that grim line that left no room for negotiation. She pushed past me before I could even step aside, moving into my living room as though it already belonged to her, Mark following with the smug expression of a man who believed the matter settled before the first word was spoken. Clara announced that she had spoken with an attorney and begun the process of petitioning for guardianship, her voice measured and deliberate, as if she were delivering a professional report rather than tearing apart what little remained of the bond between us. She said she could no longer stand by, while I endangered myself, that I was not thinking clearly, that it was a time to be realistic. The words were rehearsed, cold, polished into weapons, and she laid the papers on the table as if slamming down a gauntlet. I felt my body tremble, not with fear, but with a rising fury that had been simmering ever since the night she dragged me like a criminal from her house. A fury I had contained too long, buried beneath silence and resignation, and now it surged upward, carrying with it all the grief, humiliation, and betrayal I had endured. I rose slowly from my chair, my voice steady but sharp, and told her that I knew what she was doing, that this was not about safety or love, but about control and greed, about the house, the savings, the inheritance she already considered hers. For a fleeting second I saw her eyes flicker, a crack in the armor, but she recovered quickly, raising her chin and declaring that I was paranoid, that everyone could see my decline, that she was the only one brave enough to step in. Mark began to lecture me about responsibility, about how burdens fall on the next generation, and I cut him off with a force that surprised even me, telling him that he had no right to speak about burdens when he had benefited from every sacrifice I had made, from the loans I had quietly paid off for them years ago to the tuition for the grandchildren's summer programs. The air in the room thickened, every sentence heavy with years of unspoken resentment, and when Clara raised her voice to shout me down, I shouted back with a clarity I had not felt in decades, reminding her of the nights I stayed awake rocking her. Fevers away, the days I worked double shifts so she could have new clothes, the times I sold personal treasures to fund her education, sacrifices I had never once thrown in her face until now. The shouting match spiraled until neighbors once again gathered outside, drawn by the rising volume, and I realized with a grim satisfaction that Clara had left the front door ajar in her haste, her voice spilling into the street. As if summoned by fate, one of the same neighbors who had recorded the earlier altercation raised a phone again, capturing every venomous word as Clara screamed that I was pathetic, that I was unfit, that I would be better off locked away where no one had to deal with me. The words hung in the air like poison, and though they scorched me, they also freed me, because they revealed her true self, not just to me, but to anyone who cared to listen. I did not flinch. I did not cower, and for the first time in months I felt the weight of fear lift from my chest. I told her calmly, though my voice shook with the force of conviction, that if she wanted to take me to court, I welcomed it, because truth was on my side, because evidence existed, because witnesses had seen and recorded her cruelty. I reminded her that the police had already seen one video, that the neighbors had not forgotten, that the image of her dragging me and screaming, "Get out, old man," was not something she could erase. Her face paled, the fury faltering for just an instant, and in that instant I knew I had reclaimed something vital, my dignity, my voice, my refusal to be erased. The police arrived again, called by the neighbors, and this time Clara's attempt to paint herself as the dutiful daughter collapsed under the weight of the recordings thrust into the officers' hands. They listened, they watched, and their expressions hardened as the truth unfolded in pixel and sound. Clara tried to interrupt, tried to twist the narrative, but her words stumbled over themselves, losing their practiced polish. Mark muttered under his breath, realizing the tide had turned, and for once they looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the authority they had wielded so easily. One officer turned to me with respect in his voice, saying that I had every right to live independently, that no one could force me from my home without due process, and though the reassurance was simple, it rang through me like a hymn. As the confrontation wound down, Clara stood rigid, her face a mask of fury and shame, clutching the useless papers as though they might still hold power. I looked at her then, not with anger alone, but with something heavier, a sorrow that no victory could erase, because in that moment I understood fully that the daughter I had raised, the child I had loved beyond measure, was gone, replaced by a woman who saw me not as a father but as an obstacle. I told her quietly that she had broken something that could never be repaired, that from this day forward she would have no claim over me, not my house, not my savings, not my love. She flinched, and for the first time she seemed uncertain, but I turned away, my decision final. The officers escorted them out, the neighbors lingering in silent solidarity, and as the door closed behind Clara and Mark, I felt a strange calm settle over me, as though the storm had finally spent itself. My hands still shook, my heart still ached, but there was strength in knowing that I had stood my ground, that I had not allowed myself to be erased. The climax had arrived, and though the cost was steep, I had reclaimed the only thing that mattered, my dignity, my right to define my own life, even if I had to do it alone. In the days that followed that final confrontation, the house that had so often felt like a cage of silence began to feel different, not lighter exactly, but steadier, as though the walls themselves had witnessed the battle and now stood with me, rather than against me. I walked through the room slowly, touching the worn edges of the furniture, the photographs still in their frames, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed that Marianne had stitched decades ago, and I realized that for the first time in years, I know. Longer looked at these things with dread of losing them, but with the assurance that they were mine to keep, that no one could strip them away by force or manipulation. The echo of Clara's voice still haunted me, those cruel words shouted in a moment of rage, but alongside that echo lived the memory of the officers siding with me, of the neighbors who had chosen to record the truth, of the quiet strength I had discovered in myself when I finally refused to cower. I did not hear from Clara for some time after that night, though I knew she was simmering with resentment, perhaps ashamed, perhaps plotting, but no calls came, no visits, and I chose not to reach out either, because something inside me had shifted beyond repair. I no longer clung to the fragile hope that she might return to me as the daughter I once knew, because I understood that what she had shown was not a passing cruelty, but the revelation of who she had become, a woman for whom control outweighed love, for whom inheritance outweighed memory. Accepting that truth was painful, like closing a door on a part of myself, but it was also liberating, because it freed me from the endless cycle of waiting, forgiving, and being hurt again. Neighbors who had once regarded me with polite distance now approached with quiet kindness, dropping by with casseroles, offering rides, or simply sitting with me on the porch to share a cup of coffee. I did not need their pity, but I welcomed their company because it reminded me that even if family failed, humanity could still be found in unexpected places. One of them told me gently that the video of Clara dragging me had circulated further than she might have intended, that people in town were speaking about it, and though I did not take satisfaction in her humiliation, I felt a grim sense of balance, as though the universe itself had insisted that truth be seen. Nights remained difficult, for loneliness is not so easily banished, And I still whispered Marianne's name before sleep, still wished for the sound of her voice in the quiet hours, but I no longer did so with despair. Instead, I imagined that somewhere she was proud of me, that she had watched me stand firm when the tide threatened to sweep me under, and that thought gave me peace. I began to fill my days more deliberately, reading longer books, writing down memories in a notebook so they would not vanish, even attempting to grow a few vegetables in the garden, though my knees protested each time I bent down. Life did not transform into joy overnight, but it became bearable, and bearable was enough. Clara's absence grew into a silence that I accepted as permanent, a silence that no longer cut as sharply, because I had chosen it too, chosen to let go of the bond that had become a chain. Sometimes I wondered if she regretted anything, if she ever lay awake remembering the father who once carried her on his shoulders, but those thoughts no longer consumed me, because I understood that regret, if it came at all, would be hers to carry, not mine. My task was simply to live, to preserve the dignity she had tried to strip away, to breathe in the quiet air of my own house and know that I had survived betrayal without surrendering to it. In the end, I found a strange kind of victory not in triumphing over her, but in refusing to let her define me, in choosing solitude over humiliation, in reclaiming the right to live on my own terms. The story of what happened spread in small circles, a cautionary tale perhaps, and though I never sought vengeance, I took solace in knowing that truth had been witnessed, that lies had not prevailed. My daughter's voice may still echo, sharp and cruel, but so too does my own, steady and unbroken, carrying me forward into whatever time remains, no longer begging for love where none exists, but walking with dignity through the final chapters of my life.